If you drove down Highway 192 in Kissimmee, Florida in the mid-1980s, you would have encountered a structure that defied every rule of residential architecture. It looked like a cluster of giant white melting marshmallows, or perhaps a UFO that had crash-landed and begun to bubble in the Florida heat. This was Xanadu, the house of the future. Constructed from giant inflatable balloons sprayed with rigid polyurethane foam, these houses, there were 3 major ones in the U.S., represented the absolute peak of 1980s techno-optimism. They promised a life of total automation, where the house wasn't just a shelter, but a computerized servant. Inside, robotic voices greeted you, walls curved organically without a single right angle, and the Autochef promised to cook your meals. It was the physical embodiment of the Epcot era, a belief that plastic and microchips would solve the domestic drudgery of the 20th century. Yet by the early 2000s, this vision of the future had become a nightmare of mold, rot, and obsolescence. The white foam turned gray and green, the computers died, and the house of tomorrow became a decrepit ruin of yesterday, eventually demolished in 2005. It stands as a monument to vanished grandeur that aged faster than the traditional homes it sought to replace.
The tragedy of Xanadu is the tragedy of tying architecture too closely to specific technology. When you build a house out of stone, it can last 1,000 years. When you build a house around a Commodore 64 computer, it lasts exactly as long as the computer does. Xanadu was the ultimate smart home before the internet existed, hardwired with miles of copper cable and bulky hardware that became junk within 5 years. Once the novelty wore off and the technology failed, the architecture itself had no bones to fall back on. It was a petrochemical shell that trapped moisture and darkness. The demolition of the Xanadu houses was a form of technological prescription. Society decided that this specific vision of the future was not only ugly but uninhabitable. The site in Florida is now an empty lot, erased as completely as a formatted floppy disk. This episode explores the hubris of the foam home revolution and why the most futuristic buildings often make the worst ruins.
Welcome back to Vanished Grandeur, where we exhume the architectural dreams that time rejected. Project Xanadu was the brainchild of Bob Masters, an early pioneer of rigid insulation. In the late 1970s, facing an energy crisis, Masters believed that the traditional wood and brick house was an energy-leaking dinosaur. His solution was radical, monolithic foam construction. The method was ingenious in its simplicity and speed. A large, reusable vinyl balloon was inflated to the size of a room. Workers then sprayed quick-hardening polyurethane foam onto the interior of the balloon. Once the foam set, in a matter of minutes, the balloon was deflated and removed, leaving a super-insulated structural dome. By connecting these domes, you could create a sprawling, organic complex in a fraction of the time of standard construction. It was inexpensive, impervious to termites, and incredibly energy efficient. Masters wasn't just selling a house, he was selling a revolution against the box that humans had lived in for millennia. He named it Xanadu, after the poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, evoking a stately pleasure dome, though these domes were made of plastic, not ice.
To understand Xanadu, you have to understand the early 1980s. It was a time when the personal computer was just entering the home, and the possibilities seemed infinite. We were moving from the industrial age to the information age. Xanadu was designed to be the temple of this transition. It attracted millions of tourists. At its peak, the Kissimmee house saw 1,000 visitors a day. They walked through in plastic booties to protect the carpet, gaping at the sensorium, a room filled with eclectic sensory stimuli, the indoor waterfalls, and the CRT monitors embedded in the walls. It was the Jetsons brought to life. But it was also a product of the petrochemical age. The entire house was essentially solidified oil. It represented a specific moment when we believed that synthetic materials were superior to natural ones in every way. The vanished grandeur of Xanadu is the vanishing of that specific naive confidence that chemistry and circuitry alone could build a paradise.
The interior of a Xanadu house was disorienting. Because the structure was formed by balloons, there were no flat walls and no corners.
The floor plan flowed organically, resembling a cave system or the inside of a human body rather than a house. This biomorphic design was touted as being more natural and psychologically soothing than the rectilinear prisons of standard architecture. The ceilings varied in height, creating cozy nooks and soaring atriums. The windows were often irregular portals cut directly into the foam, glazed with acrylic. This created a womb-like atmosphere. However, this unique geometry meant that standard furniture didn't fit. Everything had to be built in or custom-made, often carved out of the same foam as the walls. This lack of adaptability was a fatal flaw. You couldn't just repaint or rearrange the living room. The room was the furniture. The architecture imposed a specific lifestyle that was rigid, despite the soft curves.
The heart of the Xanadu promise was the Autochef kitchen. The tour guides told breathless tourists that the house would manage their diet, inventory their groceries, and even cook their meals robotically. In reality, this was largely smoke and mirrors, theatrical props designed to look like automation. While there were some genuine innovations, like early climate control systems, much of the smart technology was a simulation. It was an architectural placebo. The Autochef was a symbol of the ultimate leisure lifestyle, where the housewife was finally liberated by the machine. But when the computers crashed or the proprietary software became obsolete, the house lost its brain. A dumb house is just a shelter. A smart house with a lobotomy is a useless collection of wires. The vanished grandeur here is the functionality that never really existed in the first place, a vaporware lifestyle sold to tourists.
The most legitimate claim of the Xanadu project was its thermal performance. The walls were several inches of solid insulation. In the humid heat of Florida, the house stayed remarkably cool with minimal air conditioning. This was the grandeur of engineering. Bob Masters was right about the insulation value of domes. However, foam has a dark side. It is susceptible to UV degradation if the outer paint layer is breached. It creates a hermetically sealed environment, which, without sophisticated air exchange systems, traps humidity and pollutants inside. The perfect seal became a trap. When the ventilation systems failed or were turned off after the house is closed to the public, the interiors essentially began to rot from the inside out, creating a toxic mold bloom that made the structures unrecoverable. The energy efficiency came at the cost of breathability, a lesson modern green architecture has had to relearn.
The nervous system of the house was built around Commodore and other early 8-bit microcomputers. In 1983, having a computer that controlled the lights was science fiction. By 1990, it was an antique. By 2000, it was archaeology. The problem with Xanadu was that the technology was embedded into the structure. Upgrading the system required practically tearing apart the foam walls. Architecture moves at a slow pace, decades or centuries, while technology moves at a fast pace, months or years. Xanadu tried to weld these two timelines together, and the shearing force destroyed it. The house became a tomb for dead tech. This serves as a warning for modern smart cities. If you embed the sensors into the concrete, what do you do when the sensors are obsolete in 5 years, but the concrete lasts for 50? Visually, Xanadu captured a very specific retro future. It looked like the sets of Star Wars, Tatooine, or Barbarella. It used carpet on the walls, sunken conversation pits, and neon lighting. It was the future as imagined by a disco-era designer. As the 1990s rolled around, this aesthetic didn't just become old, it became laughable. It became the symbol of bad taste. The architecture was socially prescribed by changing fashion. We went from wanting plastic domes to wanting granite countertops and Tuscan villas. The future went out of style. Xanadu couldn't adapt because its form was so aggressive. It couldn't gentrify or evolve. It could only be what it was, a 1983 foam party frozen in time. By the mid-1990s, the Xanadu houses, especially the one in Kissimmee, had ceased to be serious architectural experiments and had become fading roadside attractions. The paint peeled, revealing the yellowing foam beneath. The futuristic sliding doors stuck. The robots stopped talking. The Kissimmee location was sold and closed in 1996. For nearly a decade, it sat abandoning, rotting in the swampy heat.
It became a destination for urban explorers and homes populations who found the caves surprisingly comfortable, despite the mold. The house of the future had become a prehistoric cave for the marginalized. The decay was rapid and grotesque. Foam does not ruin gracefully like stone. It crumbles, flakes, and melts. It looked like a diseased organism, a cancerous building, on the side of the highway.
The end came in October 2005 for the Kissimmee house. The property had become an eyesore and a health hazard. The demolition was unceremonious. Bulldozers simply crushed the foam domes. Because they were lightweight, there was no dramatic implosion, just a crunching of plastic. The debris was carted off to a landfill, where, ironically, the polyurethane will likely last for thousands of years undecomposed. The vanished grandeur is physically still with us, buried underground as trash. The site was cleared, and for years it remained empty, eventually consumed by the generic sprawl of Kissimmee's strip malls. The future was paved over to make way for the mundane.
The other Xanadu houses met similar fates. The Wisconsin Dells house stood for a while longer, but eventually succumbed to the same issues of maintenance and lack of interest. The Gatlinburg house was also removed. The entire lineage of foam architecture was wiped out. It turned out that Americans didn't want to live in bubbles. They wanted traditional shapes, gables, porches, rectangles. The psychological barrier of living in a round house was higher than masters anticipated. The cultural prescription against non-rectilinear living spaces proved to be a powerful force. We are conditioned to love the box. One of the key lessons of Xanadu is the issue of maintainability. A traditional house is a collection of layers, siding, sheathing, studs, drywall, that can be peeled back and fixed. A monolithic foam house is a monolith. If a pipe bursts inside the foam wall, you have to hack it out with a chainsaw. If the exterior coat fails, the structure dissolves. The maintenance-free promise was a lie. It was actually maintenance impossible. Architecture that resists repair is architecture that is destined for the landfill. This is a crucial concept in sustainable design. The ability to repair is more important than the ability to insulate. We eventually got the smart home Xanadu promised, but it didn't look like a spaceship. It looked like a normal house with an Alexa speaker on the counter and a Nest thermostat on the wall. We learned that technology should be a layer added to architecture, not the foundation of it. We carry the Autochef in our pockets, Uber Eats apps. We realized we didn't need the building to be the computer. We just needed the building to house the computer. Xanadu's mistake was trying to hardware the software. The vanished grandeur was a misunderstanding of how digital evolution works. It is fluid, mobile, and invisible, not structural and heavy.
Looking back at Xanadu today, there is a sweet sadness to it. It represents a time when we weren't afraid of the future. We thought the future would be fun, weird, and comfortable. Today, our architectural visions of the future are often dystopian, bunkers, or strictly utilitarian, ecopods. Xanadu was playful. It was pop architecture. Its loss is the loss of that playfulness. The urban explorers who visited the ruins described a feeling of melancholy. Walking through the rotting sensorium was like walking through the corpse of a childhood dream. Despite its failure, the form of Xanadu has found a second life in modern bioarchitecture and 3D printed housing. The idea of monolithic, curved structures is returning, but this time using concrete or mud, cob, instead of toxic foam. The Xanadu shape, structurally strong and wind-resistant, makes sense for extreme climates. Bob Masters was right about the geometry. He was just wrong about the material. The ghost of Xanadu lives on in the Mars habitat concepts and the eco-villages that prioritize organic shapes over industrial grids. Project Xanadu was a bold, bizarre, and ultimately doomed experiment. It attempted to solve the energy crisis and the domestic labor crisis with a single architectural gesture, the foam dome. Its destruction was inevitable because it violated the laws of adaptability. It was a building that could not grow, change, or heal. It was a single-use product at the scale of a house. The proscription of Xanadu was the market's rejection of disposable architecture. The image of the rotting white domes is a potent symbol for the 20th century's plastic addiction. We built a grandeur out of oil, and it decayed into a toxic mess. It reminds us that new is not always better, and that some traditional building methods have survived for thousands of years for a reason. The stone arch beats the foam dome in the long game of history. The house of tomorrow is always a trap. As soon as you build it, it becomes the house of yesterday. Xanadu teaches us that the best architecture is timeless, not timely. It should serve human needs, light, space, shelter, rather than serving the gadgets of the moment. The vanished grandeur of Xanadu is a warning to not let our tools shape our homes too rigidly, lest we end up living in the ruins of our own inventions.
The melted ruins of Xanadu serve as a reminder that the future ages faster than anything else. If you were fascinated by this journey into the retro future and the plastic ruins of the 1980s, be sure to subscribe to Vanished Grandeur and tell us, would you have lived in a foam dome, or do you prefer your corners at 90 degrees? Our next episode takes us to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum, from high-tech isolation to the most densely populated, anarchic, and organic structure ever built by human hands, Kowloon Walled City, the City of Darkness. We will explore the lawless, ungoverned high-rise slum in Hong Kong that housed 50,000 people in a single city block, a marvel of improvised architecture that was demolished not because it failed, but because it was too uncontrollable. What other anarchic communities have been erased? Let us know in the comments.